Welcome to The Debate. You know, when the check engine light suddenly illuminates on your car's dashboard. Well, the standard responsible advice is to pull over immediately. You plug in a diagnostic tool and you fix the root mechanical failure.
Right. I mean, you don't just stick a piece of black tape over the warning light and pretend the engine isn't misfiring.
Exactly. But what if you're driving your family through a blinding blizzard? You're miles from shelter and the temperature is dropping rapidly. In that highly specific moment, maybe you just need to keep the engine running, warning lights be damned, until you get out of the storm.
Yeah, that is the classic tension we see in public policy, isn't it? It's this constant battle between long-term structural solutions and, well, emergency triage.
And that is exactly where the United States finds itself today in May 2026. We are navigating a severe energy crisis, triggered by the conflict with Iran and the total closure of the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, since the start of Operation Epic Fury, gas prices have surged by $1.54.
Which is just staggering.
It really is. It's pushing the national average to an agonizing $4.52 per gallon.
Right, which has prompted several states, specifically Indiana, Georgia, and Utah, to suspend their fuel taxes entirely. And furthermore, President Trump is actively considering a suspension of the federal gas tax that currently sits at 18.4 cents per gallon for regular gas and 24.4 cents for diesel.
Yeah. And drawing on economic analysis from the Penn-Wharton budget model, the Mosbacher Institute, and state-level data, we're unpacking this policy today. I argue that during an acute exogenous supply shock like the one we are facing right now, gas tax holidays provide essential immediate financial relief to consumers and critical industries, while successfully anchoring household inflation expectations before they spiral.
And I argue that gas tax holidays are highly inefficient policy tools. They drain vital infrastructure funds, enrich fuel suppliers rather than consumers, and perversely alter economic behavior without addressing the root supply crisis at all.
Let's start by looking at the reality on the ground, because acute economic shocks require immediate shock absorbers. By acute exogenous supply shock, I mean this isn't a normal market fluctuation where demand just naturally outpaces supply over time.
Right, it's a physical bottleneck.
Exactly. This is a sudden, external crisis physically blocking the oil. In the short run, gasoline demand is incredibly inelastic. People cannot simply decide to stop commuting to work tomorrow just because a geopolitical conflict erupted thousands of miles away.
Yeah, the daily commute doesn't stop.
No, it doesn't. And more importantly, our critical supply chains cannot stop. As Texas Agriculture Commissioner Sid Miller recently pointed out, fuel prices impact absolutely everything. We're talking about the cost of running a tractor to plant a field, the cost of hauling livestock, and the diesel required to actually stock grocery store shelves.
Well, the burden on the agricultural sector and the everyday commuter is undeniably real, but recognizing a problem is very different from validating the mechanism we are using to alleviate it.
But the mechanism matters precisely because a gas tax holiday is uniquely visible and immediate. It puts money back into the localized economy today, not next quarter when some rebate check might finally arrive in the mail. State taxes, in particular, are substantial.
They can be, sure.
Yeah, I mean, look at Indiana's combined use and excise tax suspension. That executive order removes 59 cents per gallon from the cost burden. That is not a marginal adjustment. If you're a local trucking company trying to stay afloat while the broader geopolitical storm rages, 59 cents a gallon is a massive, immediate reprieve that, frankly, keeps you from declaring bankruptcy this week.
Let's look at the actual mechanics of that reprieve, though, because gas tax holidays are fundamentally flawed. They ignore the realities of market friction, and they force us into steep fiscal trade-offs. The data from the Penn-Wharton budget model is incredibly illuminating on this exact point.
You're looking at the federal cost.
Exactly.
They calculate that a 4-month federal tax suspension would drain $11.5 billion from the Highway Trust Fund. To put that in perspective for the listener, that is roughly 19% of the fund's entire annual outlays. You are blowing a near 20% hole in our national infrastructure budget.
Which, I admit, sounds like a terrifying number until you measure it against the collective consumer benefit of keeping the broader economy moving. But what is that consumer benefit, really? Penn-Wharton models that for an individual consumer filling up a 15-gallon tank once a week over that 122-day federal suspension, They only save about $35 total.
$35?
Yes, total. Let me explain why that number is so staggeringly low. It comes back to the very supply inelasticity you just mentioned. When supply is absolutely restricted because the Strait of Hormuz is closed and oil literally cannot leave the Persian Gulf, and you cut the tax, the demand for gas stays just as high.
Right, because people still have to drive.
Precisely. So suppliers look at the market and realize they don't actually have to lower their prices by the full amount of the tax cut to attract customers. People desperately need the gas anyway. So they absorb a significant portion of that tax cut into their own profit margins rather than passing it down to the pump. You are sacrificing $11.5 billion in public infrastructure funding just to hand a large chunk of change to fuel suppliers, while the consumer gets a fraction of the relief.
Well, you're assuming the suppliers just pocket the money across the board. But the empirical data on pass-through rates, meaning how much of the tax cut actually reaches the consumer's wallet, shows it can be highly effective. The Mosbacher Institute conducted a rigorous study on state-level tax holidays.
Okay, but those results were mixed.
Let's look at Maryland, though. In Maryland, the pass-through rate was almost immediate and incredibly successful. Following a 36-cent tax reduction, Maryland saw a 29-cent drop at the pump. That is an 83% pass-through rate directly to the consumer. We also saw Gas Buddy data in Indiana showing prices plunging 46.5 cents in a single week following the governor's executive order.
Right, but
And that happened while bucking a national trend where prices everywhere else were actually rising.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that framing. Let me tell you why. You're pointing to the absolute best-case scenarios, but pass-through rates are wildly inconsistent because they are heavily dependent on local market concentration.
Wait, what do you mean by market concentration in this context?
It's essentially about monopoly power at the local level. If a gas station is the only one in a 20-mile radius, they don't have to lower their prices to compete with anyone. When the state tax drops, they just keep the price exactly the same and pocket the entire difference as profit. That's why pass-through rates fail. That same Mosbacher study you referenced looked at New York, where the pass-through rate was almost zero.
Zero?
Yes, almost zero. The tax went away and the price at the pump barely budged.
Well, to be fair, New York's implementation was delayed by months due to legislative gridlock. That completely muddied the pricing dynamics leading up to the holiday. Retailers had months to adjust their baseline pricing.
Even if we discount New York, look at Indiana. You cited the 46.5-cent drop reported by Gas Buddy, but there is a fascinating citizen analysis of the state's own IN Fuel Watch data that tells a very different story.
How so?
When the initial 17.2-cent use tax suspension went into effect, analysis controlling for broader crude oil market forces showed that only 6.29 cents actually reached consumers. The gas stations pocketed the other two-thirds, and if we scale this up to the federal level, the Penn-Wharton budget model estimates that only 72% of a gasoline tax cut and, crucially, just 60% of a diesel tax cut will actually reach consumers. The market friction is simply undeniable.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. Let's play out the logic of that market friction using a leaky bucket analogy.
Okay.
Imagine you are trying to put out a house fire. You have a bucket of water, which represents the tax cut. Now, you are pointing out that the bucket has a severe leak. Maybe 20 to 30% of the water drips out along the way and gets captured by supplier margins. You are arguing we shouldn't use the bucket at all because it's inefficient.
Because the leak is massive.
Sure, but if I can deliver 70% of a bucket of water to a house that is currently on fire, that is infinitely better than standing in the yard debating the leak while the house burns to the ground. The sheer visibility of that 70% relief, the fact that consumers see the price drop on the marquee sign at the corner station, matters immensely in a crisis.
I love the leaky bucket analogy, but we have to push it to its logical conclusion. The water isn't just leaking harmlessly onto the grass. It's leaking directly into the pockets of the fuel suppliers who own the bucket. We are transferring taxpayer wealth to the very entities profiting from the shortage.
But the water that does hit the fire is doing crucial psychological work. You mentioned the visibility of that price drop on the marquee sign. I think you've hit on the actual hidden goal of these policies. They are vital psychological tools. gas prices have a profoundly disproportionate impact on economic psychology.
Due to the signage.
Exactly. The Mosbacher Institute proved this. They found that because gas prices are so highly visible, literally posted in giant neon numbers on every major intersection in America, they are heavily weighted in consumer minds. In fact, consumers weight gas prices 1.8 times greater than their actual 4.3% share of household expenditures.
They definitely loom large.
Because of this outsized psychological weighting, dropping the price at the pump successfully lowers overall inflation expectations. Maryland and Florida actually saw a 0.49 percentage point drop in inflation expectations during their holidays. That psychological anchoring is absolutely vital to preventing a self-fulfilling inflationary spiral where people panic and start hoarding goods.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the paradoxical behavioral economics that the Mosbacher study also uncovered? You would assume that if people feel better about inflation and they are literally saving money at the pump, they would go out and spend that extra money in the broader economy, right? You'd expect them to stimulate local businesses.
That is the traditional expectation, yes. You give people money, they spend it.
Exactly. But overall spending actually dropped. It fell nearly 1% in Maryland and Florida during their tax holidays.
Wait, why would spending drop if people have more cash in their pockets?
Because when you artificially lower inflation expectations, you inadvertently increase the perceived real interest rate. The real interest rate is essentially the nominal interest rate on your savings account minus the expected rate of inflation.
Okay, tracking.
Let's break that down. If you think inflation is going to be 10% next year and your bank is paying you 5% interest, money sitting in your savings account is losing 5% of its purchasing power. You are highly motivated to spend that money today before it loses more value.
Right, which drives up current demand and fuels further inflation.
Exactly. But if a gas tax holiday suddenly makes you feel like inflation is cooling down, say you expect it to be 4% instead of 10%, suddenly your money isn't losing value. If the bank is paying 5% and inflation is 4%, the real return on your savings is positive 1%. The math flips. So rather than spending that extra money from the pump at a local restaurant, consumers pull back. They save it.
Which, frankly, isn't necessarily a bad thing for household balance sheets. We're in the middle of a geopolitical crisis. Having citizens bolster their savings accounts rather than buying discretionary consumer goods seems like a perfectly reasonable outcome.
It might be good for personal balance sheets, but it directly contradicts the core argument that this policy acts as an immediate economic stimulus for struggling local economies. And there is a much more dangerous behavioral consequence here, which Patrick DeHaan from Gas Buddy explicitly warned about.
Regarding demand destruction?
Yes. We are in a severe physical supply shortage because the Strait of Hormuz is closed. The market absolutely needs demand to fall to rebalance itself. High prices are the painful, necessary mechanism that forces people to carpool, cancel cross-country road trips, or optimize their commercial freight routes. When you artificially lower the price through a tax holiday, you disincentivize the exact changes in consumer behavior that are desperately needed to balance supply and demand. You are effectively telling people, keep driving as normal, while the oil tankers are physically blocked from leaving the Middle East.
But you are assuming that demand for gasoline is highly elastic and that everyone has the luxury of simply driving less. For many working-class Americans, it simply isn't an option. A farmer running a combine harvester cannot carpool his wheat harvest.
I understand that.
A single mother commuting 40 miles to a shift work job cannot simply optimize her route. The demand destruction you were talking about, the pain that rebalances the market, happens by crushing the people who have the least flexibility. That is why the psychological relief of lower inflation expectations is so important. It stops the panic for the people who literally have no choice but to buy the fuel.
I'm not denying the pain of those specific groups, but if the tax cuts aren't stimulating the broader economy, as the data shows, and they are actively discouraging conservation, we have to evaluate what we are giving up to fund this psychological relief. And the structural costs at the state and federal level are staggering.
You're referring to the infrastructure funding mechanisms.
Yes, we've established the Penn-Wharton numbers at the federal level, $11.5 billion lost over 4 months. But let's look at the devastating local impact. The Indiana Chamber of Commerce explicitly opposed the governor's tax suspension, and their reasoning was purely mathematical.
Because of the lost road funding?
Right. They noted that suspending the gas tax costs state and local communities $500 million a quarter. But it's not a one-to-one loss, because state funding is used to draw down federal grants, often where the federal government matches $3 or $4 for every state dollar put up. Losing that state revenue means forfeiting $1.2 billion in federal matching funds.
So the state loses the multiplier effect of its own tax dollars.
Exactly. And the chamber translated that directly into physical reality. That lost revenue equals 500 lane miles of road not repaired or replaced. It translates to 7,000 lost jobs in construction, engineering, and maintenance in Indiana alone. You are sacrificing 7,000 high-paying structural jobs just to shave a few cents off the pump for a few months. That is the definition of eating your seed corn.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. The job losses are a serious concern, but I look at this as a matter of immediate macroeconomic triage. We have to look at the broader picture of May 2026. The Penn-Wharton budget model also tracks the cost of the war itself. Operation Epic Fury is costing the federal government roughly $500 million a day.
It's a massive outflow.
We are hemorrhaging structural costs everywhere. Now, while road maintenance and construction jobs are undeniably important in the long term, maintaining a pristine highway is completely moot if the agricultural supply chain collapses today because diesel fuel is unaffordable.
But deferred maintenance doesn't just disappear. It compounds and gets much more expensive. A road that needs a surface repair today will need a total structural rebuild in 3 years if neglected.
I acknowledge the compounding cost of deferred maintenance. But triage means saving the patient's life today and dealing with the physical therapy tomorrow. If independent truckers go bankrupt this month because diesel is $5.64 a gallon, the cascading effects on food prices, manufacturing logistics, and basic goods delivery will completely dwarf the $11.5 billion cost to the Highway Trust Fund. The cost of inaction on acute fuel prices right now simply outweighs the deferred road maintenance. We can pass an infrastructure bonding bill when the Strait of Hormuz finally reopens. We cannot resurrect a bankrupt logistics industry once the trucks have been repossessed.
That assumes the logistics industry is actually saved by the tax cut. But again, let's look at the Penn-Wharton numbers on diesel specifically. The pass-through for diesel is only 60%. A full 40% of that diesel tax cut is absorbed by the commercial suppliers, not the independent truckers.
But 60% is still relief.
But ultimately, by subsidizing the fuel, you are masking the reality of the crisis. If diesel is scarce, the price should reflect that scarcity so the market can innovate and allocate that limited fuel to its absolute most essential uses. When you artificially subsidize it by raiding the highway fund, you prolong the structural imbalance and make the eventual correction that much harder.
Well, let's summarize our positions in light of the depth of our discussion today. From my perspective, we are facing an unprecedented geopolitical and energy shock. While gas tax holidays are admittedly imperfect and suffer from significant market friction, the leaky bucket we discussed, they provide an essential mechanism to deliver immediate financial relief. They protect critical, inelastic supply chains like agriculture and logistics, and crucially, they effectively cool consumer inflation expectations before they spiral into widespread macroeconomic panic.
And to summarize my stance, these policies are largely a fiscal illusion. They drain crucial long-term infrastructure funds and forfeit massive federal matching dollars, resulting in thousands of lost jobs. They allow fuel retailers to capture significant portions of the tax savings due to local market concentration, supply inelasticity. Most importantly, they fail to fix the underlying supply-demand imbalance in the energy market, actively disincentivizing conservation and ultimately costing society vastly more in the long run.
I think where we clearly converge is acknowledging that the Iran conflict has created a severe, undeniable economic burden on the American consumer. The shockwaves from the Strait of Hormuz aren't just geopolitical abstractions. They are being felt at every gas pump and grocery checkout in the country.
Absolutely. The debate isn't whether consumers and businesses are hurting. It's about whether we treat the symptom with a temporary bandage or respect the structural reality of the market.
and the complexities we've discussed today, from the friction of fuel economics and market concentration to the surprising paradoxes of consumer psychology and real interest rates, well, they offer rich avenues for further exploration in the underlying material.
Indeed. It brings us right back to our driver in the blizzard. Are we short-sightedly masking a critical engine failure by covering up the warning light, knowing it will cost us the engine eventually? Or are we pragmatically doing the only thing we can to keep the heater running until the storm passes? We'll leave that for you to weigh. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.